high dynamic range photography and panoramic photography. So these are two kind of specialty topics in the world of photography, but they really center around some basic important skills that relate to combining images together. So it's our gateway into how do we combine images together in the first place. So I'm going to start with high dynamic range photography first. And we touched on this a little bit earlier when I did just the basic photography lecture when I talked about bracketing images. Same thing applies here. But essentially what we're doing with a high dynamic range image is we're trying to mimic what the eye sees in a particular scene, what we visually see that we can't capture as easily in a photograph. So the technical definition is that it's a set of techniques that allow a greater dynamic range of luminances between the lightest and darkest areas of an image. So what essentially that's saying is you go out and you look at a view like this, and our eyes see and process it, and we see this. But then when we go to photograph it, it never quite looks as good. And you've probably done this when you say, oh, this is a beautiful sunset, I got to take a picture of it. And then you look at the picture after, you're like, no, it looked a lot better than that. And so this set of techniques allows us to combine those images, or to create an image that looks the way our eyes see it. And so I'm going to take a step backward and explain a little bit about how our eyes work as we start kind of understanding this concept. So our brains are magnificent in terms of how quickly we can process things. So when I'm in this room, I can look down at somebody's feet, I can look down in the shadows, and I can see detail. I can see what shoes you're wearing. I can see that kind of stuff. Even though it's dark, my eyes adjust and my brain processes what's happening. And then I can look up and I can look out and I can see, oh yeah, that's a nice sky and it's kind of bright. And my eyes adjust and my brain processes that change. And so I'm seeing the world in high dynamic, it's changing, range. So my brain and eyes are processing that information really fast, so that's how I'm seeing the world. When we take a photograph, it's a fixed range. It's either exposed for the dark, the medium, or the light. And I'm not able to change between those particularly easily. So that's a fundamental difference in how our brains and our eyes are processing versus how a camera is seeing it. And so we're using this technique to mimic how our eyes would see it. So we're trying to accurately represent what the views we're seeing, the light intensity that we're seeing. We're trying to mimic how this human eye sees the scene, which can't be captured in a traditional photograph. The other side of this, so that's the artistic side of it. The other side of it is that we can use these kinds of images as a backbone for a rendering engine. So those of you that are crossed over into my V-Ray class, my Rhino and V-Ray, we'll get to this later on in the semester. But the idea here is that we can take a high dynamic range panorama image and use it as a backdrop for a rendering. And as we change the rendering settings for the camera inside the rendering engine, the background changes with it because we have all that data to change the background. So the lighting settings in the background can change with the rendering. So it can be used in a rendering context as well. In this class, we won't talk about the rendering side of it much because we're not doing any renderings. We're only doing collage work. So we'll talk more on the artistic side of this. Tone mapping is essentially what we're doing to create the image when we combine those three bracketed images together such that it's becoming a lower dynamic range image with localized preserved contrast. So what I mean there is the light areas of the image are exposed correctly, the dark areas of the image are exposed correctly, and those might be different exposures, and we're kind of fusing it all together. So the light areas are bright enough to see the contrast in it, the dark areas are bright enough to see the contrast in it, and the middle is exposed correctly. Does that kind of make sense? So we're trying to capture that whole dynamic range in a lower dynamic range format, i.e. a print or something that you're seeing on a computer screen. It can be applied to produce accurate, what we see images. So like the sunsets that I've showed you so far, this is, I saw the scene, it was gorgeous, that's what it looks like. Or we can push the boundaries a little bit and kind of exaggerate it and become almost an artistic or painterly effect. So we can push the boundaries just a little bit further. And I'll show you examples of that going forward as well. So what we're doing as we do this reduction in the dynamic range to a lower dynamic range image is we're trying to preserve localized contrast. And so we're trying to be able to still see detail between the dark areas and between the light areas such that we get an overall image that looks like it looks in real life. So we have a couple software choices for doing this tone mapping processing. Obviously, the big one that we're going to be using is Photoshop. This is a class about Photoshop. No surprise, Photoshop's on the list. So we're going to do this today in Photoshop. We have to do this post-processing. We do the combination of the bracketed images. Then we do some post-processing to kind of enhance the image. And I'm going to talk you through that. So Photoshop can get us close when we do our merge to HDR Pro. But it's not quite tweaked perfectly, so we're going to have to do a little bit of masking, a little bit of some post-processing to kind of tweak it and make it that much better. And I'll walk you through that process today. That's because we don't have an algorithm or an AI that's doing this for us, which the last two programs that I'm going to show you coming up do have. So it'll do it for you as opposed to us having to do it. But of course, it's available on the lab computers, which is awesome, so that's what we're going to do. There are two other programs that work with this. Photomatix has been around longer, and for a long time it was considered to be the gold standard of high dynamic range. If you did high dynamic range photography and you got into it, you bought this program because that's what did the post-processing, and that's what made the beautiful images. So depending on the version or plugin, it was expensive. But it was really, really good at this tone mapping. And so if you're interested in tone mapping, you could pursue this. The newcomer on the stage is the program called Aurora HDR, which is also really good. It's made by the same company that makes that Lumion or Lumen something. That's the one I showed a couple lectures ago. And so it's kind of a competitor in this field, but it does a great job, and it has a pretty good advanced AI for doing this tone mapping without you having to do much. Essentially, you throw the images at it, and it makes your images pretty. Makes life easy. But for our purposes today, we're going to stick with Photoshop, and we'll go through that. So let me show you a bunch of examples, because I think sometimes examples help illustrate what this is really good for. So I'm going to start on the realistic end, or the practical side of why high dynamic range imagery is important. And so this first one, I'm showing you two images. The one on top right up here, that one is the low dynamic range. It's just a single fixed image. And the one on the bottom is the HDR. Okay, so the high dynamic range image. So let's say that I'm a real estate agent, or I'm a leasing agent for this building, and I want somebody to want to lease this particular space. If I post the picture on top, you coming in wanting to lease the space would look at it and say, yeah, you know, it's kind of a nice open space. Yeah, okay. You know, I might want to have my office there, or I might want to live there. But I really wonder what's going on outside those windows. If I had an image that was like this that had the view out the windows, everything inside would be too dark, and I wouldn't be able to evaluate, would I like to be in that space? Is it good? Could I see the detail of the space? The one on the bottom, so this one down here, we're seeing what's happening in our view as well as what's going on in the space around the view. So I'm getting the best of both worlds. So if I'm able to see this lower image online deciding my space, I'm far more likely to sign up to lease that space than I am the top space. So in a very realistic sense, in the world of real estate or leasing, this makes a huge difference in trying to get people to want to rent or to lease this particular space, or I guess to buy this particular space. So here's another example. The photos on the left side here are the ones that are, so these photos here and these photos here, those are the ones that are the low dynamic range. And you can kind of see, especially in the bottom here, like, okay, that's kind of blown out. We're not seeing particularly good detail, and likewise, this little fern is really dark and in the shadows. If we look at the high dynamic range equivalent, wow, look at how good that view is. I mean, it's almost too saturated. It's almost too beautiful. But that's okay. I get a sense for what that view would be. And at the same time, I can see the plant and I can see the details in the corner. It doesn't look like a dark, grungy space. So I'm getting the best of both worlds in that high dynamic range version of it. I look at this upper photo and I just look at how much my kids would trash that house. Like, they would destroy that. But it's significant. You can still see the difference, right? There's a major difference in how you're choosing to display that particular image. Okay. So from a real estate standpoint, these high dynamic range images can really make a big difference in selling a particular product. So you can use that to your advantage. You know, we're talking here about leasing and buying and whatever, but let's say that you're one of my industrial design students, this bunch right in here. Let's say that you're in that realm and you're trying to sell a product. If you use the same kind of a technique to sell the product, people are seeing the full details of what it is, the full details of the background. It can make a big difference, even if it's something like this. Now, I know this is a scale that you guys aren't familiar with, because it's a house, but imagine a small object here instead. Same thing applies, same rules apply. It's just a technique to let you appreciate the full dynamic range of what's happening. So I'm going to skip through some of these because, just kind of go through fast, because I don't need to stop and really comment on all of them. But something like this is a perfect example of there's nothing really out of the ordinary about this image. There's nothing that's super artistic or super weird. It's not post-processed too far. It just looks like a nice image. It could be cropped a little bit differently, so we had better rules of composition, like the rule of thirds, for example, or whatever. But you know what? It's a nice image. But what makes it important is that if this wasn't a high dynamic range image, everything down here at the bottom, I should be drawing on here, everything down here in those plants, that would be all black. We wouldn't see it. You know, we'd certainly see the tower with the lights, but we wouldn't see the sky to the same extent. So that exposure would really change as we looked at this particular image. So it's subtle. The high dynamic range doesn't have to be overpowering. It can be subtle, but it can make a big difference in the quality of the image. Something like this doesn't look like it's a particularly high dynamic range image, but we wouldn't see the detail down here in the bottom of the shadows. That would all be washed out and would be black. So it can be very, very subtle. Now there are some issues when it comes to high dynamic range images. So remember, I talked to you guys about the fact that this is a fusing of 3, 5, or 7 images. Right? We bracket those images and we take those exposures and we fuse them together. So we have a fundamental problem when objects move. So it's great when we have a still. Everybody's sitting still, everybody's not moving, we can take the picture, life is good. But if something moves during those 3 photographs, and they could be taken really close together. A lot of the good cameras, the digital SLRs and stuff, have a bracketing mode where you can fire 3 consecutive shots, 1, 2, 3. So it's quick. It's not like your phone where you're trying to fumble with it. But at the same time, things still happen. So if we look down here at this car, for example, you can see that that license plate is happening in this particular image twice. So there's an artifact as something moves through the scene. Same thing happens out here. I think this car you can see 2 or 3 times because it's moving. Same thing happens with people. This person right here has no head because he's moving. And the way that those images were fused together, we lost that person's head. So that's something to be aware of when you're trying to take these images and fuse the images together. They work great for landscapes where things don't move. But if you're in an urban context like this, you're going to get these kinds of problems. So it's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if you guys were looking at this particular image and I hadn't pointed out that that guy was headless, you might not have even noticed that he was headless. And you would have said, oh, that's a really nice image, and concentrated on something else. So it doesn't mean that it's bad. It's just something that you need to be aware of. That's a consequence of this method of processing photos. So something like this is just really about enhancing shadows and making the shadows not quite so deep. Okay. We can also go in the direction of the creative. So this is where we're not trying to make the photo look realistic anymore. We're trying to take that photo and push the boundaries. It becomes artistic, not realistic. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it certainly can have a little bit more mood to it. And it might become a little more painterly. And that's okay. It just has to be something that you intend to have happen. And so something like this in San Francisco, you know, it's close to reality. It looks reasonable, but there's a certain kind of glowiness to it. It's hard to describe exactly what it is about it, but there's a certain ethereal quality to it that's just not quite exactly what it really was. You know, this is like the stereotypical haunted house scene. And so if I was out taking this particular picture, given the amount of sun that's actually cast on the roof, I don't really think the sky would be this foreboding. But it fits with the look of a haunted house. Like, I feel like this is a haunted house. Like, you're selling me on this haunted house. So it's a bit over-processed, but I like it. And there's nothing wrong with it being over-processed. Now we can start pushing the boundaries further. So something like this is becoming very painterly. You know, the sky wasn't really quite that dramatic. I've been on the Golden Gate Bridge. I've never seen it look like this. So to me, and this is again a personal opinion, this is going a little bit far with it. It's pushing the boundaries a little too far. And I don't know that I would like to have this hanging on my wall as a piece of art. I think it might be too much. So you just have to understand where's that boundary, what feels right and what doesn't. So this one I included because it's a full 360. So it's 360 degrees. We'll talk about panoramas in the second half of this lecture. But if I were to take this side, it would match up with that side if I were to curl it around. Furthermore, if I were to take the bottom and curl it in and the top and curl it in, it would become the inside of a sphere, essentially. That's what this image would be. So something like this, you could especially see it down in the texture of the wood and how that's like kind of overdone, that it's just becoming a little bit more exaggerated. You know, something like this where you see the really dark moodiness to it, it's probably a little bit much as well. So let's talk about panoramic photography next. So we did high dynamic range, and that's that combining of 3 images. In this context, the combining of the 3 images, or the 5 images, or the 7 image, they all line up. They're all one on top of the other. They're the exact same image with different exposures. When I talk about panoramas, these are images that overlap each other, that are not the same, but they have overlap. And in this context, the ideal panorama would be where the exposure is consistent for the whole image. So we're not changing the exposure. So quick definition of a panorama, it's any wide-angle view or representation of a space. So it's more than our standard view. It's more than a standard photograph. We're getting wide view here. A 360 panorama is a full 360 degrees. So it would be if I started here and I turned all the way around and I ended right there. It would be that view. A full 360 might also, it could be just 360 horizontal, but it also might be 360 vertical, where you're going all the way up to dead center and all the way down to dead center that way. So I think this image, this was part of, actually I think this was part of my grad school portfolio. I went back to grad school in architecture, but my main focus had to do with panoramas, and I got really obsessed with panoramas for 2 years. But anyway, this kind of idea of all these overlapping images that form the inside of this sphere, that's kind of what I'm talking about here, where we're taking all those individual pieces and we're fusing them together to provide that field of view. So in order to do this, you used to have to take individual photos and stitch them together manually. So I might take 12 photos going around and I would stitch all those 12 together. And then I'd move the camera up and I'd take another 12 and I'd stitch those 12 together. In the world of our phones, life got a lot easier because we can open up panorama mode and go and take it. Essentially what our cameras are doing is fusing images together. They're just doing it for us on the fly, as opposed to us having to do it after the fact. I would argue that you might have a little bit more control if you're not using the panorama mode on your camera. So I used to spend a lot more time talking about this, but it kind of is becoming more and more irrelevant because of our phones. But there's a few mechanics that are important, and it's related to this term called parallax, this one right here. And these are errors that happen when you're trying to stitch images together, depending on how you capture the images to begin with. And so the fundamental rule here is to move your body or camera around the nodal point of that camera. And what I mean by the nodal point is there's a point inside the lens of the camera where the light actually, as it's coming in, flips and goes upside down before it hits your sensor. That's how it passes through the lens. And that point, that nodal point where it flips as it goes through, is the perfect center point of your image. So in our phones, it's almost impossible to know where that point is because it's so small. right? It's inside the lens, inside the thinness of the camera or whatever. So in the world of our phone, all we essentially have to do is, instead of taking our panorama like this, which is what everybody does, you take your panorama like this. And you move instead of your phone moving. In the world of an actual camera, it can make a big difference. Let me show you the errors that start to happen. And then I'll come back and explain why they happen. So if you've looked at Google Street View, you've seen this kind of stuff before. You have these power lines, and they don't match up in space. Or you have, that one's not a particularly good one, you have a building like this, and there's these sudden jumps or shifts as they come together. And when this happens, it has to do with how you're taking the image. So I'll go back to this slide here. And so you can imagine this being set up in this room. If I were taking an image from right here, and I took the image and I was dead center on that pole that's standing up, and at the same time I was dead center on the chair that's way in the back of the room down there, and I took the image. And then I swung the camera this way. If I swing the camera like this, and you can even do this with your eyes as it starts to happen as you look out the corner of your eye, that post and the chair no longer line up in a row because I've not worked around my nodal point. If I isolate the camera and I move the camera, right, so the same thing happens with your eyes. I should make you all stand up and do this. It's silly, but it makes a lot of sense, right? So in this context, I move my head, and as I'm looking out, the chair and the post don't line up anymore. But if I instead move my body, and I'm looking that way, they stay in alignment. So I'm essentially doing the same thing with the camera. So if you understand that principle, you will fundamentally get better panoramic images when you're trying to capture a broader field. Same thing happens on your phone. Now, I can't help it if you go up and down when you take your photo. That's your own problem. You have to figure that out. But you will get better results and better stitching without errors if you move rather than swinging your phone. Okay? So if you're taking them with an actual camera, it makes a much bigger difference than when you're taking it with your phone. Your final results. You're going to have an unrolled image. I'm going to show you a bunch of unrolled images today. Or you're going to have some kind of an interactive VR or maybe a movie where you can choose what you want to look at. So you could put on a VR headset and you could look around, right? Or you could be working on it on a computer and drag the mouse and kind of look at what you wanted to look at. And you guys have all experienced these before. The technology, shockingly, has been around for a really long time. This kind of stuff where it was always still images, it wasn't video images, but you could do this back in like 2002. So it's been around for a while, and it's just slowly been evolving. Now we finally have the processing power to be able to do video with it, which is nice. So let's talk about software. Guess what? Photoshop's on the list. No surprise, it's Photoshop class, right? So it's available in the lab, that's great. It can stitch small groups of images really well. So you pick a group of images that overlap, it'll stitch and do a great job at it. We're going to do that together live in just a little bit during the demo. If you throw a full 360-degree panorama at it, so we have all the pictures all the way around, Photoshop has a hard time of determining where to start and where to end. Where's the beginning and where's the end, and where does that last image, well, wait a minute, it kind of overlaps over here, so it gets confused. So it's better for like a collage, a half of a panorama at stitching than it is with a full panorama. If you really want to get into full panoramas, there's a few software packages that do it. One's called PTGUI. The other one, I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this because there's another version called Huggin that is actually free and open source that you could choose to download today if you wanted to, if you got interested in it. And it runs based on the same underlying code, so you might as well use the free one. It just takes a little bit longer during the processing time. The idea behind these kinds of software programs is you load in the images and then you can manually go in and say, this point on this image is the same as that point on that image. So as it warps and unrolls the image, it can kind of customize and tweak for little mistakes during the capture. So it ends up being a really high quality result. Most of the panoramas that I've taken ran through, well actually most of them ran through this version, but it's essentially the same as the Huggin. So it's a lot more control, takes a little bit more time. It's free. It used to be installed in the lab computers, but they don't bother anymore, even though I ask them to. So it is what it is. You guys will play around with Photoshop for our purposes today. But if it's something you find inspiring or you want to play around with, by all means, use it. There is another one that's available for iOS and Android that's Google Street View. I think it used to be called Google Sphere or something like that, where it will actually set you up with, you take the image and then you move and it kind of stitches on the fly. It's pretty cool. I tried it out a while back. I was on the beach in Hawaii, and I was like, oh, I'm going to try this out, because I'm always prepping for class, and I should try this out, and I did it. And then about a year ago, I got a notification, hey, congratulations, your photo just reached 100,000 views. Like, I didn't even know it was on anything. So it's kind of funny when you do this stuff. You can do the same thing. It's pretty easy. You can download it, and it'll walk you through how to snap. It works great for outdoor spaces. So I was on the beach. I got a great stitch. Everything was good. If I were to do it in this room, I'd have all kinds of parallax errors because it would be really hard to hold the camera in exactly that nodal point as I was taking the images. And that, if you look up at the ceiling, all those lines, those would never stitch right. So working on this indoors, not so good. Outside, works really nice. And you get pretty good results. All of this is leading toward 360 video. This is becoming more and more available. I think YouTube has a whole channel based on 3D video. The idea here is that we wear a headset and we can choose what to look at. So it's interactive. So instead of just seeing what the director wants you to see, you're seeing the whole scene. You're seeing everybody in front of and behind you. It's never really caught on. Like I said, it's been around for a long time, and it's never been the thing that, like, oh, everybody has to have a headset and wear the headset. Technology is getting better and faster, and the video quality is getting better. I wouldn't be surprised if eventually this falls into being something that we all do frequently. But for right now, it's there. I like you to be aware of it, etc. So let's look at some sample panoramic images that are unrolled. There was a program called Stitcher that was fantastic at doing these stitches. Obviously, it wasn't included in there. It was great. It stitched them better than like anything. It was an independent company. Autodesk, the people that make AutoCAD, bought it in 2009 and effectively killed it. They never updated it. They bought it and then just let it die. So it's really sad because it was a great piece of software. So on some of these, I actually stitched them with Stitcher. That was the software program at the time that was working with it. But a couple key things to point out when I look at these images, or when you look at these images, is that things that are curving in the images are straight, and things that are straight in these images are actually curving. So it takes a little bit of getting used to. The other thing, when you're capturing this whole group of images, is you want to make sure that exposure is consistent for the whole set of images. So in this particular context, the exposure is accurate in all the images except for this one image right there. And you see the other half of the image right there. That image was wrong. And so when you stitch it, you get that little gray artifact. Could I fix it in Photoshop? Sure. Do I have a fixed version of it? Yes. But I included this so you could see that as a problem during these stitches. So here's another set. This is a full 360 horizontal, but not vertical. So you get the little scalloped edges on the top and scalloped edges on the bottom. This is again up in Peru. So here's another example of where things get messed up. So I was taking this. This was supposed to be a full 360, which meaning it goes all the way to your feet, all the way up in the sky, and a full 360 around. And I missed a couple images when I was taking it. So you end up with that black hole. Could I Photoshop in? Sure. Could I do some collage work and fix it? Yes. But you want to make sure that you're capturing all of them as you go through. So I told you that things that are straight in a panoramic images are curved. Things that are curved in the panoramic images are straight. So in this context, we have these straight horizontal lines. What's that tell us? Those are actually curving. That's at the center of Marai. So the camera was set up right there in the center, looking at it. So we've got those concentric rings. So if you look at the panorama, they look like all horizontal straight lines. So that's a good illustration of how that changes the perception. This is one of the samples that I'm going to give you. It is a full 360, so you guys can play around with that and how it stitches together. It also ends up being a pretty high resolution image because you're combining all these smaller images together such that you could actually take this image and zoom in and see across the canyon at what's happening on the other side of the canyon, which is kind of fun. This was the other side of the canyon. Same thing as with the high dynamic range where we were taking the 3 shots together and the car moved with the license plate. Same thing happens in panoramas. So we're in this context, we're taking a whole bunch of images and we're stitching them together. So there's a much broader stretch of time that happens as you're capturing the image. So you can end up capturing a lot of ghosts of people as they're moving through a particular space. This particular image spawned a lot of my thesis. It was in the old Amtrak train station in West Oakland. I think they've torn the building down now. Does it still? It's a cool building, but not. Yeah, I know. This was probably in 2003 or 2004, and it wasn't too bad at that point, but it's a really cool old building. Anyway, if you move on to Berkeley, you're going to spend a lot of time looking at this. Same thing here, where I had the exposure mistake up at the top. This one's a lot harder to fix. You can fix the sky, but fixing it on the building is a little bit more tricky. The truth is, most of the time you'd see it like this, because you'd be there at night. Side story, just for the fun of it, all the lights in the Worcester Tower, this is the architecture building at Berkeley, all the lights in the Worcester Tower, the building on the right side of this complex, they all have motion sensors. So they'll go off if people aren't on the particular floors. And so you can tell who's on what floor based on what time the lights go off. So the city planners down on floor 3 and 4, those lights go off at 5. They're out. Right? The landscape people on like 4 and 5-ish, they stay around a little bit longer, but they're out at about 7. Then you have the undergrad floors, and they think they're pretty cool, and so they stay up later, so they might, the lights might go off at 11. The 9th floor, which is the grad floor, those lights never go off. They're on 24/7. So it's kind of interesting. You can always tell. If you walk into Berkeley, look up at the tower. I always look at the tower and see who's working. 9th floor is always on. So here was an example. God, this is going way back in time, back when I had hair. This was in about 2003-ish, and we were playing around with panoramas. This was in the computer lab. Check out the quality of those computers, those Emacs. Those were hot stuff, baby. And what we were doing in here is we actually, when we took the panorama, we took pictures of ourselves in every one of the pictures. So this was me and a buddy of mine. He made a bunch of money. He sold his company to Nokia, and I wish I worked with him instead of being here. But anyway, we had a lot of fun. Sorry. I didn't say that out loud, did I? So we had a lot of fun doing this kind of stuff where, you take lots of pictures of us, and then when you stitch it, we end up looking at ourselves and whatever. You get the idea. So you can play around with that. This was over at the Chabot Space and Science Center. A good example of how when you fuse images together, you lose things. So there's a half a person in here. You see just the legs at the bottom. It was a small space, and I was quickly taking a panorama at the time and didn't pay attention to the fact that she was standing in one of the pictures and not the other pictures. So just something to be aware of as part of this. This one was on the Brooklyn Bridge, and this one was one that I actually shot by hand. So I didn't have my tripod with me at the time, but it shows you that you can get a pretty darn good panorama if you understand that nodal point isolation. There's no parallax errors. Everything is seamless. All those the sides of the bridge and all the crisscross lattice and whatever all match up correctly on all those images because I was very careful when I shot to move myself around the camera, not the camera around myself. So that's really a key idea here. So this is more example images. I'll start flipping through these quicker if my iPad core likes me here. I think this is one of the other sample ones that I gave to you up in Tahoe that you guys will be play around. You can play around with how they look and end up being more artistic and what have you. These are all images from my thesis. My thesis centered around the airport in SFO. How I ended up doing a thesis when I have no interest in airports, I have no idea. Like I should have been doing housing on my thesis, but somehow I ended up in an airport. Go figure. Same things happen though. There's a half a person there. So these were all just quick snaps. I had tons and tons of these as background for the thesis. But as part of this whole process, I had to learn how to draw in panoramic perspective. So I had to do these constructed perspectives so that not only was I capturing what was happening when I proposed, these are the design things that I was doing, everything had to be in these panoramic perspective drawings. So I had to figure out how to actually draw in that context, which was kind of fun. Not something that you could do by hand. You had to use the computer to do it. But anyway, they were constructed perspectives, and it was kind of fun. The end drawing, this was like in process of it. The end drawing was like a 21-foot backlit drawing. It was a really cool drawing. Of course, I don't have any pictures of that anymore, but you get the idea. Yeah, this was part of the end drawing. So I had this panoramic perspective, and then you were projecting these other perspectives on the walls as you were walking, so you'd see crossings in this space. Anyway, the thesis part, like you look back on it now, and you're like, why did I write about that? How did I write 85 pages on that? Anyway, you'll discover that when you get to grad school. Blending modes are something that is very powerful, that's built into Photoshop, and it's not something that's that common for people to teach you initially. And so you work with the tools that you have. And I think that it's one of those tools that once you understand what it does, it suddenly opens a whole new door for what you can do. So I really want to emphasize it, and I've been doing that over the last couple of classes or the last couple of years of teaching, and I think it's something that's a really powerful tool for you guys to use. So what are blending modes fundamentally? Essentially, a blending mode is kind of like if you imagine 2 sheets of trace paper. Let's say you're drawing, right? And you draw something on your desk, and then you put a piece of yellow trace over it. Well, your drawing has a yellow cast to it, right? So the tracing paper itself made your drawing look kind of yellow. Let's say your first sheet was white. If you, instead of putting a yellow sheet on, if you took out a white sheet and put it over, your drawing would look different. If you took out a red sheet and put that over, it would look different. Blending modes are kind of the same thing. So they have to do with opacity. They have to do with how one layer transforms or changes the layer below it. And the key here is that there are different mathematical examples that control how that opacity or how that color shift is happening. It's kind of like picking the red paper or the green paper or the yellow paper or whatever you're using. The difference here is that we're not picking colors. We're actually picking how the color of the, or not necessarily the color, but the black value or the gray value of the layer that's on top affects the layer that's on the bottom in terms of what's transparent and what's darker. So I'll show you some of these kind of live as we go through. There are different groups of blending modes, and unfortunately the names that are in these groups are really not self-explanatory. But generally the things to keep in mind are we have a group here that's all about darkening the image. So the most common here is multiply. That's what we'll use today. It's that one right there. That's generally about darkening the image. We want to make things a little bit darker. The next grouping here is about lightening the image. So everything that's in that group right here is about lightening the image. We're going to use screen as our primary one. So the first one is multiply. Second one is screen. The last one is in the contrast section. So it's this section right here. And we're going to be using the overlay mode primarily. Later on in the semester, we'll use the soft light as well. But for today's purposes, we're going to stick to just those 3 major ones: multiply, screen, and overlay. There's a few other ones. There's luminosity. We'll touch on that today. There's a few other kind of specialty ones. But for the most part, those are the ones that we're going to be working with. So there they are, isolated there as well. You can see them. So let's try to do an illustration here of what's happening. So I've got 2 layers, and I've put these in kind of 3 dimensions so you can see which layer is on top of the other. The first layer, layer 1 here, is a gradient at the bottom, and then a black square, a medium 50% gray square, and a white square. And that layer is over the top of an all blue layer. So the bottom layer is all blue. So we're looking at how does this black, gray, and white affect the blue layer depending on what blending mode we're choosing as we go through. So when I look at them together, there's the top layer. Okay, when I look at them together, this is what I'm seeing on the screen. But of course, because they're different layers, I could turn off the black square, the gray, the gray, black, white squares. I could turn those off and just see the blue, or I could turn the blue off and just see the squares. But what we're looking at is how they apply when we apply a blending mode to them. So we're going to pay a lot of attention in multiply to what happens to the dark square and what happens to the light square. So this is the first blending mode. And remember, I talked about this being about darkening the image overall. The function here is darkening. So what's going to happen is the areas that are lighter in the multiply layer, so remember the topmost layer is the one that has the multiply applied to it. The things that are lighter than the background color are going to become transparent or semi-transparent. So here the white is going to go away. It's going to become transparent. completely transparent. The gray is going to become kind of 50% transparent, and the black is going to become darker. The blue is going to become darker. So let's see how that actually happens here. So once I apply the blending mode to it, you see that the white goes away completely. It becomes transparent. The medium makes it a little bit darker, the blue a little bit darker, and the black makes the blue a lot darker. So if we switch blending modes to the next one, we're going to do screen. Remember, this was about lightening the image overall. So when we do this one, what's going to happen is the black, and actually I made a mistake on this slide and even on the one that you'll see on when you do the sample today, that black isn't truly black. It's about 90% gray, so it's not quite going to become completely transparent. The middle is going to become, the blue is going to become a little bit lighter for that 50% gray, and then the white is going to become, well, it's going to stay basically white. So it's going to become really light. So remember, this is about lightening the overall image. So when the effect is applied, there we go. So the black is becoming transparent, or almost transparent in this case. The light is becoming, the blue is becoming lighter, and then ultimately it's becoming white. So this is about how that top layer is applied to the bottom layer. Last one, overlay, and then we'll do the demo all together, which will make a lot more sense. But I like to talk through it at least a little bit first. So on this last one, this is going to be the overlay layer. So we're paying attention to all three of the squares. So in this case, the darks are going to become dark, the lights are going to become light, and the middle is what is going to be transparent. So if you, well, I'll show you the example. There we go. So the middle becomes transparent. The dark becomes darker, the light becomes lighter, and the middle stays transparent. So if you remember back to last class, we did that dodging and burning. And remember, I had you go in when you were creating it, you said layer, new layer, and then you said, I want the mode to be overlay, and I want to fill with a neutral 50% gray. You check that box. So what we were doing, let me go back for a second here, is we were filling the layer with this, that neutral gray, which becomes transparent. So it wasn't affecting the image at all. And then when we did the dodging and burning on that layer, we added some black, some dark to make things darker. We added some white to make things lighter. So we were using this blending mode last class, and you didn't even know it. So it's a perfect example of how this stuff kind of weaves its way in. So that's it for the actual formal slides. What I want you to all do is I want you to log in, if you're not already logged in, and I want you to go to today's exercise 105. And right up there at the beginning, there's a sample file. It's called ps-blendingmodes.psd. I want you to download that file from the website while I switch over, and then have that file up, and we'll talk through what's happening with those various blending modes. So I pulled up exercise 105 right here, and this under part 1, download the sample file ps.blendingmodes.psd. That's the file that I want. And so I'll click on it, and it will download here. And then I can go ahead and click on that ps.blendingmodes.psd. And it'll open up in your Photoshop. Okay, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to walk around and make sure everybody has it, because this is one of those times where I want to do everybody together as we walk through it. And then you'll turn loose to do your actual work. So bear with me for a second. I want to make sure everybody has it up. Okay, so we're going to keep going. I'm going to work through the sample file with you guys. This is the part 1, just so that you understand what's going on. Then we'll actually go through and apply it to photos so you can see how it impacts photos, etc. So first off, in this sample file, I want to explain to you what we're seeing in terms of our layers. So I have the background layer, which is that blue color, exactly what I showed in lecture. And above it, I have this layer 1, which is, if I turn off the background, we can see that it's just the gray, dark gray, light gray, and white, and then the gradient across the bottom. I have 2 other layers, layer 2 and layer 3. Those are little kind of drawing layers. I'm going to show you how those apply in just a little bit. We'll leave those off for right now, and we will turn back on the blue background layer. So really, applying blending modes is relatively easy. All we need is the layer itself that we want to have the blending mode applied to, and then the blending mode is going to be listed up here in our layers palette. And that it currently says normal because it's just a basic layer. When we click on normal, we see that list of what I was talking about. So these are the darkenings, these are the lightenings, these are the kind of mid-range stays transparent, dark and lighten at the same time. The nice thing about Photoshop is it gives us a little preview. We don't even have to fully select it to see it. As we scroll through, we can see what's happening. So in the case of our purposes here, we're going to use multiply as our first example. So if I click on multiply, you see that the white becomes transparent, exactly like I was doing in lecture. The blue here becomes darker blue. So the gray is applying to the blue, it's becoming darker, and the black is applying to the blue and becoming a really dark blue. So it's really about darkening the image overall. If we switch from multiply, instead of multiply, if we come down to our next mode and we go into screen mode, in that mode, we've got the white basically becoming, or the white making the blue white. In this case, the medium gray is making the blue a much lighter blue. And then the dark here is becoming relatively transparent. Like I said, it's about 90% gray instead of full black. Someday I need to fix that so it's full black. But you guys get the idea of what's happening. So in this case, the black is becoming transparent, and overall the image is getting lighter. And then if we switch from our screen mode down into our overlay mode, we're seeing that the mid-range is the part that's becoming transparent, and the dark area is becoming a much darker blue, and the light area is becoming a much lighter blue. So we've worked through those three basic ones: multiply, screen, and overlay. Now, how do those apply in a kind of a practical sense? We're going to go through today and we'll talk about how it applies to photos and post-processing of photos, but I want to show you something else that we're going to use later on that I think is the undersung hero of what the Adobe products can do with blending modes that people forget about. And so you guys have probably attempted this before. You're working on a portfolio or you're working on a poster and you have something that has a white background and you need to get rid of the background. And so by default, most people just try to select the background and delete it, which is what is common. If it's in fact a white background, you don't really have to delete it. You just have to change the blending mode for how it's applied. So we're going to go ahead and turn on layer 2, which is a black and white drawing. Okay, so I have black lines on a white background. This actually, I think this came out of SketchUp, but it could be out of any program, right? I have a black and white drawing here. I'd like for that white to become transparent so I could put it on some kind of a backdrop, whatever it is. In this case, it's going to be a blue backdrop, but you get the idea here. So what I can do is just change the blending mode. So the lines are going to stay black. I'm just changing so that the white becomes transparent. So I'll go ahead and select layer 2, and I'll change my blending mode here to multiply. Actually, I need to turn off layer 1 there. And when I do that, and I know it's hard to see on the screen, but essentially all of my white turns transparent, and my lines stayed that nice black. So it's a way of quickly adding transparency to something that has a white background, and it's really easy to do. If I used one of the other ones, like the screen mode, for example, right, in this case, it's actually showing where the lines are, what's in the background. So it's showing the blue from the background through where the lines would be, and keeping the white foreground color. And then in the case of the overlay mode, there's not really anything that's happening here. It's not helping me out. I also have the inverse. I have the white lines on the black background here. And so in this case, the natural choice would be screen mode, because screen would make the black transparent. And so when that happens, we're seeing the nice white. So this is kind of like the old school blueprint look. So we have screen mode. In this case, multiply mode doesn't really do much. It just gives us a black background. And again, the overlay mode doesn't do much. So I just wanted to point those out because it's something we'll use later on in the semester during a lot of your collage work in Photoshop. So it's an important skill to recognize and keep in the back of your mind. But for today's purposes, it's not that relevant. So those were my demo stuff. That's part 1. We all did that together. The next part, under part 2, we're going to play around with photos and how you might be able to enhance photos. So instead of picking one of your photos that you went out and took, in this case, these work better with older faded photos. And typically, if you're taking photos with your iPhone, they're not going to be old and faded. So we're going to go find some old and faded pictures online. So I'm going to use the Creative Commons search. It's search.creativecommons.org. Actually, it looks like it's now ccsearch.creativecommons.org. And this just lets you find Creative Commons licensed images. And so I'm going to type in like old photograph or something like that. And you know, I'll scroll through here, and what I'm looking for is something that's not something that's kind of faded. So something like this that's kind of faded. Okay, that's probably a good one to play around with. And so theoretically, I should be able to download this somewhere. Let me just go ahead and save image as. Maybe. Told you, today's not my day. Technology's not liking me.
Yeah, I think we broke the website.
Oh,
we can not loading for us.
Oh.
Error. Yeah, the error.
Classic. So the alternative would be to Google image search. I think if you broke Google, I'd be impressed. Let's put it that way. But if you're doing a Google image search here, and you say old photograph, these aren't necessarily Creative Commons licensed images, but you can go into, I think it's under your tools here. If you click on this tools button, you could go to usage rights, and this is where you can choose something labeled for reuse with modification. That's what you're doing. You're reusing it with modification, and that way you're actually allowed to play around with this. So we can look through here, and again, I'm looking for something that's faded such that we might be able to see or correct some of what's wrong with it. And one of the reasons that I don't pick pictures ahead of time, so obviously I could sit up here and just, oh, I'm going to open these pictures, is I want you guys to see that typically when you're trying to find an image to work with or you're trying to find something to collage with, it takes a while to go through and find the image that actually would be worth spending your time on. I liked my first image. Okay, we'll use that one. So let me go ahead. Watch, I'm going to have an account. This is the way my day is going, right? Or it's not going to load, one or the other.
So what's the difference from actually downloading it from the website versus just pulling it off of the Google?
Generally, you get a higher quality image when you go to the website.
Oh, okay.
But there we go. So I can get the original size. No, I don't want to. See, I told you it was going to be this way. No, I'm not paying for that image. Go back and see if I can get this one again. No, it's not going to like me, is it? I can't win today. At least you guys know that I struggle sometimes too, right? There we go. Ha! I got an image. Excellent. There it is. So I'm going to go ahead and open this image up in Photoshop. So I'll right-click on the image and say Open With, maybe. Photoshop. And there we go. There's my old and faded image. And I want to try to enhance. I want to work with this image a little bit. So we're going to go through and we're going to play around with what multiply will do to an image, what screen mode will do to an image, and what overlay mode will do to the image. The steps that we're going to are very similar. I'm asking that when you start to save your images, if you pick an image, you have the original image and then you have the modified version. So as you go to post it later on. If you want to use the same image for part 2, 3, and 4, that's fine. In that case, you'll have one original image and 3 separate processed images. If you pick different images for parts 2, 3, and 4, you'll have 6 images rather than 4 images. Right? So original plus the modifications. So let's go through the modifications. What we're going to do And we actually have two different strategies for how we apply the blending modes to a layer. The first one would be to go ahead and add a levels adjustment layer, which we did last class. So that would be go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and we're going to do Levels Adjustment. So Layer, New Layer, Levels. There it is. Or excuse me, New Adjustment Layer, Levels. And we'll go ahead and do the levels adjustment. So I can darken it up and I can lighten it up. That by itself certainly helped the image. But on top of that, I'm going to change the adjustment from, or the blending mode from being normal to being multiply. And so you can see we went from this faded image to one that has a lot of rich black to it. We really punched out the black and gave it a lot of kind of extra context. Now in this case, this image isn't going to benefit too much from a screen mode, so it might be better to pick a different image and see what happens there. I'm going to go ahead and open up another image. I have some examples that I think will show this a little bit better. If my computer will work and let me open another image. I told you, it's not my day today. Nope, can't open it. That's real nice. All right, so I guess we're going to apply, oh, you know what, maybe I can get it off my flash drive and open it that way. Okay, so I picked up another image here, and so with this image I'm going to do a similar modification, only this time I'm going to use the screen mode for it. So once again I'll go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, Levels, and then I'll go ahead and pull these in, which is already helping. And so in the screen mode I'm going to switch the adjustment to screen here. And so in this case, when we look at what's it really enhancing, it's not helping the sky, certainly, and it's not helping the mountains in there. But if we looked here in the trees, zoom in here just a little bit more, right there in the trees, we could see a lot more detail once we brighten that up. And so it helps in that context. So in this example, it's helping in that area, but really detrimental in the sky. Alternatively, if I went into multiply, we'd get really good results from the sky, but this becomes almost a completely dark, black blob. So that's not really ideal either. And that's where the third mode comes into place, which is the overlay mode. So we're getting a little bit of lightening and a little bit of darkening both together. And so this is, again, always about, the eye of the beholder, what looks good to you. And it doesn't mean you have to apply them all. Like in this particular image, I don't think screen helps at all. I think multiply really helps the image, and I'm betting that overlay really doesn't help either. So really, in this context, multiply is the best for this particular image. Now remember, this is an exercise, so it's about playing around with it, understanding how to do it, and even if the end result doesn't look as good as you might want it to, that's okay. We're just trying to go through and learn the various techniques. So I've done that for multiply, I've done that for screen, and I've done that for overlay, and I would save each of those images along the way. So I'd have an original, and then I'd have the modified version for overlay. I'd have the original, I'd have the modified version for screen. I'd have the original, and I'd have the modified version for multiply. The next one that we're going to do is called Luminosity. It's under Part 5. And this one's one of those ones that's a little bit different. What we want here is we want an image that's dominated with reds and blues. So like sunset images or things that are highly saturated. And I'm going to show you how to do that. Let me go ahead and open up a file here. I'll go to File and then, oh no, that's right, I can't go to Open. Working with this stuff sometimes is just killing me here. So I'm going to pull up a sunset image as an example. And so what I'm going to do here is a little bit different. So previously I always went to the levels adjustment and I started with that and then applied my blending mode to the levels adjustment. This time we're going to do a curves adjustment. So I'm going to go ahead and go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and it's going to be Curves. And then right here from curves, I'm going to do that traditional S curve that I was talking about last class, where I peg the center, and then I pull this up slightly, and I pull that down slightly like that. So that by itself helped the image a bit. But I can take it a step further. I can take that adjustment layer, and I can change and provide something called luminosity. And this is one where you really have to see it on the screen to see what it does, but it really enhances the color quite a lot. So I'm going to encourage you to play around with this and see what that does on your own screen, because you'll see it a lot better. Let me open another one and see if I can demo it again for you. Oh, that's right, I can't open things. No, I don't want it open in Paint. All right, here's another image here. So same thing, I'm going to go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and this one's going to be Curves. I'll set up my standard S curve, so I'll peg the center, pull the top up a bit, pull the bottom down just a bit. Here we go. And then I will apply the luminosity blending mode to it. And then you can toggle it on and toggle it off and see the difference. I don't know how much you guys can really see. Yeah, you guys can't see it very well on the screen. This is one of those things, that's why you have to do it, because you'll be able to see it a lot better when you're doing it on your screen. Okay, so that's luminosity. All right. The next one under part 6 is putting in some kind of a grunge background. And this is something that you'll find can really add depth and texture to your images, and also can add depth and textures to renderings, because especially in the world of renderings, you create a part and you do a rendering of that part and you put it in a scene and you want it to look realistic. Well, things are always slightly dirty. Like, they're never perfectly pristine. I mean, I guess when you first take them out of the package for the first time, they're perfect. But then from then on, they have a little bit of dust on them. They always do. And so I think the best analogy for this is, you guys are all familiar with like the Toy Story movies, the Pixar movies, right? Okay, so there's a whole department within Pixar whose only job it is to add dirt to everything. That's it. They add dirt. They make it look dirty so that it feels more realistic. And it takes that whole department, and that's part of why you go and you see, you know, Toy Story 4 or whatever, and you're like, wow, that animation is really good. It's because somebody spent time putting dirt on things. And it sounds silly, but that's how real life is. Things are always slightly dirty. And so you have to add that layer of dirt. It adds a layer of realism. So in the world of photographs, I'm just going to play around with this particular photo again here. We can do the same thing. We can add that little bit of dirt or a little bit of background texture to any one of these images. So what I'll do is I'll search for something called a grunge texture. It might be easier to do it in Google. So I'll type in grunge texture. And when we pull up grunge textures here, you can see that they really vary. Some of them are really intense. Some of them have scratches to them. Some of them are lighter. Some of them have darker edges. Some of them mimic paper. Some of them mimic concrete. There's a bunch here that you can kind of go through. Any one of these is perfectly fine for you to pick. Once you pick one, and actually I should switch this so it's licensed for reuse. So let me go into my tools and then my usage rights, and let's say it's labeled for reuse with modification. There we go. That means I know I have rights to actually work with this here. This one's going to be a one that you can really see what happens. It's not going to look the best, but it'll help me illustrate the point. So I'll go ahead and I'll go there, and let's see if I could download this one. That's right, of course, I can't win today. Let me see if I can do it by dragging. There we go. We'll do it by dragging. So what I can do then is I can bring in that image. And we're going to bring in that image by going up to the File menu here, and I'll go to File and then Place Embedded. So it's File, Place Embedded. And I can then go, oh no. I should, if my computer was working, I should be able to browse for that particular file. It should let me pick it. But of course, this is not working that way. So we'll have to work around it. Let's see if I can drag it in. There we go. So I'm just going to, using drag and drop. Such is life. I need to make this big enough. If I want it to stay, it's going to stay in proportion as I go to move it. If I want it out of proportion, I can hold down the Shift key and have more flexibility. I just want this to take up the whole size of my existing file. I'm going to go ahead and click this little check mark when I'm done. That means commit to the size. It sharpens up a bit. It's not the highest quality image here. But now I can take that layer with the image on it, and I can change the blending mode on it. So I'll change the blending mode first to multiply. And you'll see that now this looks like it was printed on a piece of paper and was crinkled up. If I switch from blending mode multiply to blending mode screen, it looks awful. If I switch from that to blending mode overlay, I kind of get somewhere in the middle of the two. So I have to decide which one of these looks the best and then commit to it. Now if I didn't like this particular one, like I said, the texture was a little bit too much, I might bring in a different one. And let's see, let me go back here and pick one. It's a little more subtle. Something like this sometimes is good when it has darker edges around it. So I'm going to use that one for right now. Actually, you know what? Let me go to the actual website here. Of course I can't find anything. We'll go ahead and drag it. And then we'll drag that one in here. There we go. I would recommend not doing the drag and drop thing because I'd rather have higher quality. All right, so I'll bring it in about like that. And it's not even the right proportions here, so let me... That's the one nice thing about the grunge textures is you don't always have to keep them in proportion because you can't really tell what they are anyway. So that's where holding down Shift can help you. So there it is. Now when I go in and I change the blending mode on this, let me commit to the size here. When I change the blending mode, let's say to multiply or to overlay, we're getting a darkening. It's almost a vignette effect on it. So maybe it's multiply. But in this case, it's just too dark. It's too much. I can come in here and right next to where it says multiply, there's an opacity slider. And it's at 100%. If I change this down, it'll control how much of the grunge is applied. So maybe I only want a little bit around the edges or I want a little bit of scratch to it. And I can do it that way. So this is applying a grunge texture to a background. Spend some time actually searching for them. I have on my flash drive, which of course I can't access, I have a whole folder of grunge textures that I've saved over time. So if I go into my resources folder, I have a folder called grunge textures. And these are all high resolution grunge textures that I've saved to go back and work with. You know, some of them are based on paper, some of them are based on concrete, some of them have other, bizarre background textures. There's concrete. And so I've just kind of collected and saved these over time. They're all free to use or Creative Commons licensed. And so I can use any one of those on these images and we could see what would happen. So I could put this one on, for example. And let's see here. Let's Shift. It's kind of similar. It's probably a little bit higher quality. Like that. And once again, I can go through my various modes here. There's multiply. It's a little bit darker on the edges. But you guys get the idea. I'm actually going to do these slightly out of order because I think it illustrates the masking point a little bit clearer. And so we're going to start with that and then we'll move backwards into doing the panoramas afterward. So a couple things. If you took either a bracketed set of images or the group of images that are going to overlap to stitch, you're more than welcome to use your own set of images. If you don't have those images and or would rather use mine, that's okay too. That being said, I should also mention that you're exempt from comments for this exercise, so you don't have to comment on this exercise because generally speaking, people are going to use my, my samples anyway. I have exercise 106 pulled up here. At the bottom of exercise 106, I have sample sets of the panoramic images, set 1, 2, and 3. I also have sample sets of the high dynamic range images, group 1, 2, and 3. and you guys are more than welcome to use any of those, and those will be the ones that I'm using for this class. I do also have a link here for the first two of the panoramic images so that you can actually see what the panorama turns out to be. This one is an interactive one, so again, if you click on it and look at it, as we're looking at this particular image, if you look straight up, I didn't capture straight up, nor did I capture straight down. So that's where those black holes exist. But it gives you kind of a sense. You can look around and see what's going on in this set of images. This is obviously up at Lake Tahoe. For those of you in 136 or who have taken 136, the final project in 136, one of the sites is over on this shoulder right there, just for reference. This is the other set of sample images, and then the final one is the ET Courtyard, which you guys are all very familiar with, so I don't need to show you that. But this is the one in Peru here, and you guys can work with this. This you can see a little bit better through to that side. That was what I was talking about through the little space there. This one is a full 360, so we can look straight down and see everything on the ground, and we can look straight up and see everything that is straight up, and obviously look around from there. So you guys are more than welcome to click on those links and see what it is that you're going to be working with today. When you go to download these images, if I'm not mistaken, you have to actually click on them, and it brings up Dropbox. And there it is. You don't have to actually sign in to Dropbox. You can just click on download and then say direct download, and it'll download that folder directly to the computer here. But you do actually have to click and go to the Dropbox site. I host it on the Dropbox site rather than on the website, because if all of you tried to download it one time, it would take forever. So we'll let Dropbox handle the bandwidth for that instead. So we're going to start by doing the panorama set. And it's pretty easy to initiate the command. Like I said, it's an automated action in Photoshop, so Photoshop does a lot of the work for you. You'll go up to the File menu, and you'll come down to the Automate menu, and then come over into the Photomerge option down here. And when I click on Photomerge, a Photomerge dialog box will appear. We have a column for layout. The auto layout generally works great, so you don't have to worry too much about the other example pieces. The source files here, this is where we need to go find the source files. If you downloaded my sample images, you're going to be picking from my samples. If you have your own set of images, you'll go find your own set of images. The idea here is that the images need to overlap. And in an ideal sense, the images should overlap by about a third. So if you were to divide up your image or have that viewfinder with the grid on it, you want about a third to overlap in each image. That makes it pretty easy to stitch. So I'm going to go onto my flash drive. I have a folder for today. We're in 106 here. And I have all the options. I'm going to pick, I don't know. Let's pick this one in Peru. And instead of picking all of the images, I'm going to pick a group of images to stitch together. Remember, I told you you could throw all the images at it and see what happens, but I'm a little hesitant to do that. So I'll pick a couple images centered around that door. Something like that. Get a couple more down here at the bottom relating to that door. I am, by the way, holding down the Control key on the keyboard as I'm making my selections. That's allowing me to select small groups of images. Once I'm done, I'll go ahead and say OK, and it loads in all of those images for me. And down here, I have the option blend images together. Yes, that's what I want. Vignette removal would be if there were darkened edges around the particular photographs and you wanted that to be removed. I didn't have that, so I'm not going to worry about that too much. Geometric distortion correction. Again, if I had a lot of distortion in the images, I could correct it. And so I'm going to go ahead and stick with just the blend images together as checked, nothing else. And I'll say OK. And because this is an automated action, first thing Photoshop is going to do is it's going to start loading up a bunch of the images. And so it takes a little bit of time for Photoshop to load in the various images. There we go. Let me see if I can open up the layers. No, it's not going to let me open the layers while I do this. So we're not going to be able to see it. I should have opened those first. All right. So like I said, I picked a group of images. So you can see that this final result, I'm getting some distortions on the edges. And you can see that each one of the individual images has been warped. But as these combine together, I'm not seeing any seams between the images. So it did a very good job of merging the images together. Let's take a look more carefully at the layers palette here and see what actually is going on. So Photoshop gave me a bunch of layers. There isn't a background layer anymore. It's a bunch of individual layers. And each of these individual layers has a photo on it and then also a mask applied to it. So there's two little things that it's showing. So let's jump all the way. I'm going to turn all of these off for illustration purposes, and I'll start with just this image right here. So the image itself, come on, is this. And so Photoshop looked at my images, and because of some of the distortion of the lens and whatever, it did a little bit of a bump to the image. It pulled the center out just a little bit, distorted it a little bit, so that it would stitch together nicely with our other images. And then it said, but I don't need all of this image. I need just a piece of that image, because the image next to it, right here, actually that one has very little applied to it. Let me see this one right there. There we go. When they combine together, there may be some artifacting where these two images come together, although it's actually done a pretty good job. And a lot of that is the quality of the camera when you originally shot it. But anyway, so those two images combine together, and then on top of them, Photoshop has done a layer mask to it. And that's this black piece here that's choosing what parts of the image are actually shown. So instead of the whole image, Photoshop has cut out just this piece of the image to show. The image next to it, this image, has part of that image cut out for it. This piece and this piece joined together such that there is no seam between the two. It's perfectly seamless. So Photoshop has done that for me. What the mask allows us to do is to control what parts of the image are actually seen versus what parts of the image are not seen. In this scenario, Photoshop did the work for us. So I didn't have to do any of the actual masking. But I could, let me duplicate this layer for illustration purposes. Hold on, duplicate layer, there we go. I'm going to turn everything off. There it is with no layer mask applied to it. Sorry, I did the wrong layer. There we go. There's my image with no layer mask applied to it. I can actually add a layer mask manually, for example, and I can do that by selecting the layer, and we'll go through this several more times today. Clicking on the button down here for Add Layer Mask, that gives me, notice, a white square, not a black square. What is white is shown, what is black is masked off or gone away. It's kind of like taking a piece of tape and covering something up. I can do that with the black. So I can come over here to my paintbrush tool with black. I'm going to need my brush to be a little bit bigger for this illustration. And what I paint in black will become transparent. The cool thing about a mask is, so let's say I got rid of that piece of this image. The cool thing about a mask is you can change your mind. I could go back to white, and I could paint that back in and get it back. So it's not a permanent change to the image. And that's what masking will give us. So I'm going to leave this for right now with all of my images together. This is the part 2 where we're creating a panoramic image, and you're going to be exporting it and then posting that as part of your work. It's a group of images. It's not the full pano. If you want to include more images, you can give it a shot and see how many Photoshop can handle. Like I said, when you throw all of it at it, it tends to get a little weird around the edges. So that's part 2. Part 1, we're going to work with a bracketed set of images, and you'll spend more time doing the actual masking. So in this example, Photoshop did the masking for you. In the next one, we're going to do the masking ourselves. So the process of creating the HDR image is to go to File and then Automate, and instead of Photomerge like we did with the panos, it's going to be the one above it that is Merge to HDR Pro. And so I'll go ahead and click on Merge to HDR Pro. Notice I didn't have to have any files open to begin with. I just had to initiate the command with Photoshop being open. So in this scenario, I'm going to pick my bracketed set of images. Remember, this is usually 3, 5, or 7 images. Here under my HDR, I have all 3 sample sets. I will do it 3 times so you can see the process 3 times. There are those 3 images: correctly exposed, underexposed, overexposed. I'll take all 3 of those images here and I'll load them into my Merge to HDR Pro. I do want to leave the check for attempt to automatically align source images. If you shot them on a tripod where they were exactly the same, you wouldn't have to do this. Generally speaking, it's a good practice just to go ahead and check that box. I'll go ahead and say OK. And Photoshop will open the 3 files. And then it's going to work to combine them together. Once it's at this stage, we get the Merge to HDR Pro dialog box here. And so you can see all 3 of the photos down here at the bottom. This is the end result where they're coming together. You can see that there's actually a little bit of an artifact, a ghost, right along the edge of that peninsula there, which is an artifact of problem of me when I actually did the shot, not something that Photoshop's doing for us. And so once I have those 3 loaded in here, we're going to look here under Preset. And I'm a big fan of the presets because you can go through and quickly try out a bunch of different examples. So you could go to City Twilight and see what it looks like. You could go to Flat and see what that looks like. You could come down here. I'm going to skip the monochromatics. I can go to More Saturated, see what it looks like there. I can go to Photorealistic High Contrast. I can come down to Photorealistic Low Contrast. I could go to Photorealistic. That one's looking pretty good. And you can continue going through all of the rest of them. Surrealistic is where we get a little bit beyond what it actually looked like. Let's go, I don't know what Scott 5 is. There we go. Probably somebody who worked on Photoshop, right? So photorealistic's not too bad. You could try this check mark for remove ghosts, see if it'll do it for us. There we go. That sharpened it up nicely. So go ahead and try that out. And then we also have a lot of options here for other more specific adjustments that can be made. So if we wanted to come in here and we wanted to, say, lighten the shadows, for example, I could move this slider over and the shadow areas of the photo are going to become a lot lighter. And it was at -50. I could also make them a lot darker, depending on what my end desire was. Likewise, the highlight slider here can brighten up the sky. It's only brightening the lighter sections of the image. So you can choose how much of that you want to have done. Vibrance, remember we talked about vibrance and saturation last class. Vibrance is the non-skin tone colors. Saturation is all the colors together. So you can play around with those and see whether you find those to help out your image or not. Same thing here. So maybe I'll bump those up. When I'm done, I can go ahead and say OK. And it will create the final image for me. You have to wait for a little bit while it builds it. And there it is. We've gone ahead and we built it. And it turned out reasonably well. Sometimes they turn out well, sometimes they don't. I'm going to go back through and do it again for a second set of images. I'll go to File, and then Automate, Merge to HDR Pro. I did the sample set 1. I'll go down to the sample set 2. And there's 3 images. This is in Yosemite. Correctly exposed, underexposed, overexposed. I'll go ahead and say OK. This is from the top of Half Dome. And so I'll go ahead and take these 3 images, and I'll say OK. It'll give me those images, and then the same set of sliders exist. So I can work through and decide what combination feels right. Maybe I want my shadows to be a little bit lighter. Again, you can play around with what the sliders mean. I'll go ahead and say OK at this point, and it will create my HDR, and there's my HDR image. Now, sometimes we want to make corrections to just a part of the image. So let's say, for example, that on this image, I wanted to work on this ground, and I wanted to change the levels adjustment so that that ground stood out, or I wanted to adjust it with curves. I can do either one of those. So let me go ahead and go into my, and actually, scratch that for a second. For illustration purposes and masking purposes, I'm going to work on this because you'll be able to see it on the projector, I'm going to turn part of this image black and white. So I'm going to go ahead and go up to my layer, new adjustment layer, and I'm going to do a channel mixer, which is how we turn the image to black and white. And I'll say OK. And on the channel mixer properties here, I'm going to check for monochrome to turn that to black and white. Now, typically you wouldn't convert a sunset into black and white. I'm doing this because you'll be able to see it a lot easier on the projector than anything else that I'm going to do. And it'll illustrate the mask that much better. So when I've created the channel mixer, and I'm not going to worry about the settings so much for right now, when I've created the channel mixer, notice that I've got the adjustment that's applied, and right next to it is a white square. In the layer menu, whenever you see a white square next to your image or next to an adjustment layer, that white square is a mask that's been set up for you. So in this scenario, it's a mask, and it's telling Photoshop, apply the black and white adjustment layer to the whole image, because everything is white in that mask. If I start to change this mask such that parts of this mask are black, this black and white won't be applied to that anymore. It's kind of like masking it off with a piece of tape. So in that scenario, I want to change, and I want to have, say, just the sky in black and white, but I want the ground to, no, let's do the ocean in black and white, but the sky to be in color. So in that scenario, I would need to paint on the layer mask right here in black the area that I don't want the black and white to be applied to. So I'll click and make sure that my layer mask is selected, so not the adjustment nor the background. I want to make sure I click on the layer mask itself right there. I'll come over to the paintbrush tool, which is right here. Looks like a brush. And then I'll come up and I'll increase the size of my brush, and I'm also going to increase the hardness of my brush for right now to 100%. And so when I go ahead and I paint, I'm going to paint whoops, sorry, and I have to paint in black. So black and white are my foreground and background colors. I need my foreground color to be black. So essentially, if it's not, you just flip them with that little double-sided arrow, and you get black as your foreground color. And now when I paint, there it is, that circle that I just painted shows up on the mask right here as a black circle. And it also shows me that this circle is now in color. So I've masked off the adjustment with that little bit of black. If I continued and I painted in the whole top half of this image, like that, you can see that I'm slowly starting to paint the whole top of the image like that. This top is becoming in color. Notice down here on my mask that it's no longer just white. I'm seeing a little preview of what has been painted in black. And I can get a little bit closer here and go right along the edge there. So sometimes you make a mistake. And so in this scenario, I'll zoom in a little bit. I went too far right there. You guys can't see it as well. If you make a mistake, that's perfectly OK. Here, let me make a bigger mistake. Oops, there we go. I made a mistake. If you made a mistake, the great thing about a mask is you can go back and correct it. So there it is in black. There's my mistake right there. All I need to do is go to my brush tool and switch from my foreground color being black to my foreground being white. I'll do that with the double-sided arrow here. It's now white. And then I can paint white back over and correct the part that I made a mistake on. Like that. I could come over here. By the way, I'm panning by holding down the spacebar key. And I can make sure that the black and white is a nice line right at the horizon. Right along there. Like that. I'll press Control-0 to see the whole image. And now the sky is in color, but the rest of the image is in black and white. So I was able to use the mask to help that. Maybe I want to enhance the sky a little bit more. I could go up and I could do a curves adjustment layer. Let me go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I'll choose Curves this time. Same thing applies. I get the adjustment and I get a mask. Everything is, the curve is being applied everywhere. But I could go ahead and I can work on it. Now, if I'm working on just the sky, I don't care so much about what's happening until I get the sky the way I want it. So it doesn't matter that the lower half of my image is becoming too dark. I have the sky the way I want it. That's great. Now I need to use the mask to paint off the part that I don't want this to apply to. So in this case, it would be the lower half of the image. So I'll come back, being on the mask itself. I'll come over and paint with black. So I'll flip my color so the foreground color is black. I'll paint with the brush, and I'll paint all of this down here. So that is no longer, that adjustment, that curves adjustment is no longer applying to the bottom half of the image. So I would take some time, I would zoom in, and I'd make sure that I cut that nice and sharp along there. I might even have to decrease the brush size to kind of fine tune this and get in there like that. You guys don't need to see me sit here and really work to enhance all of this, but you should get the idea of what I'm talking about. Make sense so far? So let me press Control-0, and there it is. I've enhanced the sky using a curves adjustment, and I'm not having it happen at the bottom of the page. So let me flip over into the next one here, this high dynamic range. Let's say that I wanted to make the sky darker here. I could use the levels adjustment in this one. So I could go to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I could say Levels. Okay? And I could adjust just the sky. So again, all I'm really concerned with is the sky. So let's say I like the sky like that instead. But I don't want it to be happening on all the mountains. So in that scenario, once again, I'll click on the mask. And then I'll use my paintbrush using black as my foreground color. I need to make my brush a little bit larger here. And I'll paint off the lower part of the image. Bless you. Okay, so I went a little bit too high right in that section. You guys still should be able to see it. So I can correct it by adjusting my brush size down and then switching to white. And I can correct it. Sometimes on these edges, it helps not to have, oops, that was a mistake, sorry about that. Helps not to have as hard of a brush. Remember, I had my brush hardness turned to 100%. Soften up the edges of the brush a little bit as you come in here, and it'll be a little bit easier to get right to the top of those trees. Remember, if you go too far, whoops, you can always flip your colors and come back and correct it. So the great thing about a mask is it's not permanent. So you can always make some corrections and fine-tune your mask. So I can go back in here and print a little bit more right along like that. Come back, flip, adjust, and keep working my way through. So obviously this would take a little bit of time to get it just right, but you can see how I work on it back and forth. And that's then masked off this lower half of the building, or lower half of the photo, so that we're just adjusting the sky and not what's below. So I'm selectively controlling what's happening to a particular image. This works on any of the adjustment layers without a problem, but it also works on regular layers. So let's say that I wanted to add some clouds to this sky because I didn't like the clouds that were here. I could go into my Creative Commons search, and I could say cloudy sky. And I could find some clouds that I liked. Okay, so let's say I like this one right here. I'll go ahead and download that image in its full size. And once it's downloaded, I want to copy it over to my flash drive into today's folder. So I'll jump over to my OneDrive. And let me just create a folder for today. and I'll go ahead and paste it, and there it is. I can then take this photo and bring it in to this scene. So I'll go to File and then Place, and I'm going to place Embedded. And I'll take that photo right here, and I'll drop it into the scene. Now, I need to make it a little bit bigger so it matches up with my scene. So we'll go, and I'm holding down Shift to keep this in proportion. About like that. Sometimes you need to kind of see how they match up to each other. So I might adjust the opacity so I can kind of see through it a little bit. This could go up to right about there. I want to make sure that the horizon in this image is lower than the horizon in my image. So we'll say it's about like that. I'll increase the opacity back up, and I'll commit to this. So obviously this image with the clouds is on top of this image down below. I'd like to get rid of the bottom of this image so that I can see my image down below. And I can do that with a mask. So right now, all I have is the image itself on this layer. I can add a layer mask to this, that white box next to it, by clicking on the Add a Layer Mask button. It's the rectangle with the circle in the center of it. And when I click on that button, it's going to give me the white square that's next to this image. So with the white square that's next to this image, I can then go ahead and paint, using my brush tool, with black onto this particular image. And so as I do that, my scene starts to come back. Let me make my brush a little bit bigger so that this happens a little bit faster. There we go. And if I'd spent a little bit more time, I could get rid of some of the highlights right along the edge here by using the white to make that go away. So in all reality, I would zoom in to make these adjustments. You guys don't need to see me do it perfectly. I'm illustrating the points of the system far more than anything else. And suddenly, I've added the clouds to the sky because I've masked off that part of the image. Does that start to make sense for how these are going together? I could take it a step further and make these two match up a little bit better by throwing a blending mode on that layer. So maybe I'd go in and do a multiply blending mode, or that one didn't turn out as well as I wanted. Maybe it's a lighten or a screen blending mode. Yeah, that one turned out a little bit better to kind of blend those two together a little bit more. It's not necessary, but it's certainly something to be aware of. So we could go back up to normal, and you can see it like that. So again, I could selectively adjust certain parts of the image. Let me say that I want to adjust the bottom part of this image here. Again, I would go up into my adjustments, layer, new adjustment layer. Let's do levels. And again, I'm only concerned with the bottom of the image, so we'll brighten that up a little bit, and I want to deepen the shadows in that part. So it looks like that. Well, it looks a whole lot worse on the projector. Yeah, maybe like that instead. So again, I'm only concerned with this part of the image. Okay, so I'll go ahead and add the layer mask, or excuse me, I'll paint on the layer mask with black, and this time I'm painting the top of the image. So we'll make my brush a little bit bigger. There it is. We'll paint off the top so that my adjustment isn't applying to that part of the image. And it's only applying to the lower part of the image. There it is. So hopefully you guys can see it on the projector. Yeah, it's subtle. Trying to think if there's one. Well, I'll illustrate it with this, and then we'll do it again somewhere else. So in this scenario, I've applied it just to that bottom part of the image. But let's say that I said, you know what, I really want that bottom part of the image to be black and white for some reason, or I want to perform another adjustment on it. I can go up to Layer, New Adjustment Layer, and I can say, let's do a channel mixer, and let's convert it to black and white. But I only want the black and white to apply to the bottom. So right here, I have an existing mask, and I could paint it again. But I just did the same mask right here. I would like to take this mask and copy it onto this layer rather than having to recreate it. I can do that. Unfortunately, this already has a mask on it. So I need to get rid of that mask before I can copy the new one to it.
So I'll right click on the mask and say delete layer mask. It'll go away. I'll click on the layer mask here from the levels adjustment, and I'll hold down the Alt key on the keyboard. And when I do that, I can then drag this mask up onto the channel mixer layer, and it will make a copy of it for me. So I only have to make the mask once, and then I can copy it to multiple layers. You just have to hold down the Alt key when you do it. So I'll do that again using this using this sunset. So let's say we're back to where I was working on, trying to remember. Yeah, it was the black and white one. Right, where that's masking off so that the bottom half of this image becomes black and white. If I wanted that to copy over onto another layer, I can go into layer, new adjustment layer. Oh, let's do a curves adjustment. And for illustration purposes, I'll brighten that up just a little bit. And again, I'm trying to do stuff that will work on the projector so that you guys can see me. So in this scenario, I've done my curves adjustment. I want to copy this mask up onto this layer. Remember, you have to delete the mask first. If you copy it, and I hold down Alt, and I go up here, it's going to, improvements. In CS6, it wouldn't do this. Now it says, do you want to replace the mask? So yes, I do want to replace it, and there you go. It's replaced it. And so that's a good strategy for once you have a mask that's fine-tuned and really nice, not having to create it again. So it makes your life a little bit easier. So today's purpose is really to play around with masking and understand how masking works. It doesn't matter what the final image looks like. This is about learning to mask. We will spend more time masking in classes going forward, but I would rather have you to really understand what a mask is and how it works right now. And then when you move on, you can specify and get a little bit better at it. Yeah.